Nintendo's cast of different heroes consists of one of the most captivating characters among the medium. It's no coincidence that many developers dream to have the opportunity to create a game with Mario or Link and realize their own interpretation of these iconic protagonists. We may remember them because of their amazing adventures and clever gameplay ideas, but it's also hard to deny how memorable their designs and mannerisms are. Samus, for instance, is the prime example of an amazing female hero, and even though she tends to stay quiet for most of her adventures, her actions speak a whole other, more empathetic language. Because of their simplistic approach, Nintendo characters are often destined to appeal to children. Whether they find them relatable to some extent or simply stylish, every one of us has at least one main lead role we can connect with. When I was a kid, I gravitated towards the other side, however. At least, if not even more imposing, are the antagonists, which remain as one of the most charismatic villains in the industry. People like to complain about fighting Bowser endlessly, but when it comes to the RPGs, he's a fan favorite and without a doubt entertaining like no one else. Or take a look at King K. Rool, a more insane foe with a severe identity crisis, but the same desire to win over his arch enemy no matter how many times he loses. Just take a look at the general reaction of King K. Rool coming back for Smash. There's just something exciting about seeing our heroes clashing with not less than equally thrilling opponents. Both of them are just a few examples, and there are obviously more rivals we know and love to show their skills. It's clear they do not share the same character traits, as Ridley, for example, portrays an extremely brutal nature. But there's a common pattern of Nintendo protagonists having at least equally unforgettable counterparts. Sometimes these enemies are either a little too serious or formulaic to appear in every game, so secondary rivals fulfill a similar role. Nonetheless, we will never get rid of the leading opponent completely. One of these antagonists is King Dedede, Kirby's first and most remembered rival. Appearing in Kirby's Dream Land for the first time, the self-proclaimed King of Dreamland steals all the food from its citizens and is defeated in a final showdown up at his castle. Ironically, this should remain the only time in the franchise where the egoistic penguin is the sole, not controlled antagonist in a Kirby game, which makes one point more than clear: Dedede is probably the friendliest Nintendo rival. After that, there were only a few occasions where the penguin disrupted the peace of Dreamland for some reason, but even so, it was still coated in a light-hearted tone. While Dedede was never truly a villainous character to his core, it's hard to deny the trend of him becoming more of an ally, especially in modern entries. Many fans seem to enjoy this amicable manner, but I cannot shake the feeling that something was lost during time. Something about King Dedede's portrayal in today's games doesn't quite fit with me, to be honest, and the entry which made this feeling tangible was none other than Kirby and the Forgotten Land. But before I touch on that topic and explain what went kinda wrong with King Dedede, on top of the resulting hurdles the developers therefore have to face, let's look back and pin down how the King of Dreamland shifted from a self-centered, lazy rival to a kinda meanish ally. As stated, Kirby's Dream Land was the first entry in the series and, accordingly, had to introduce the whole universe and relationships of the characters. When fighting Dedede, it's immediately obvious he dissociates himself from the crueler-looking Nintendo villains and represents a more goofy punching bag. We got the depiction of an egocentric, weirdly confident foe, whose clumsiness was even directly incorporated into his moveset. Following the first game, Kirby's Adventure once again gave us a similar Dedede fight, only to reveal how he wanted to stop Kirby in order to prevent a greater evil. It was the setting stone of many games where King Dedede was often simply possessed by some kind of malice, but even so, a few ones still knew how to show his true character. Kirby 64, for instance, displayed a proud king who doesn't let a chance slip to embarrass Kirby. Even after winning a fight, you can clearly see his inner conflict, and if it wasn't for one of his trusty subordinates, maybe he would have never even followed the squad. By this moment, it was quite understandable when the developers wanted to use the king as a serious antagonist. Whenever there should be a greater evil, something that comes from another universe or seems rather demonic for the franchise, King Dedede would sidestep but still participate in the events leading up to the climax. There was nothing particularly wrong with this approach, because it shouldn't take too long until my favorite portrayal of King Dedede should follow. The Kirby animation show is not canon to the story or lore of the games and tells an alternative narrative, where Kirby is still a baby and has to fight all sorts of monsters which are ordered by King Dedede. Many people like to point out how this adaptation is one of the few successful video game series, as the anime is faithful to most of the characters, understands its audience, and conveys an accurate impression of what the franchise is all about. One character especially stood out to me as highly charismatic, as I always enjoyed expressive villains more than the good guys in all sorts of entertainment media. Obviously, King Dedede is the generic enemy of the whole show, and despite him not being the final villain at the end, it's fair to say he portrays the antagonistic force in most of the episodes. Here, it's important to notice that I'm talking about the original Japanese release of the show and will leave out the Western meme lord Dedede. This is important to emphasize because the dub of a show can sincerely influence how you see a character based on their voice, manner of speaking, and overall translation quality of the script. How many times did it happen that you found a specific character in some show incredibly annoying just because you could not bear to hear an either unfitting or inexperienced voice actor? While Western Dedede surely has his merits, he gives off a completely different impression, sounding extremely aggressive sometimes, while the Japanese version reminds me of the fat, greedy, lazy king he's supposed to be with his more deeper, swampy voice. Although I will admit, Western Dedede's laugh is pretty on point for what they were going for. With this being said, the reason why the show was so faithful and accurate to its source material is Masahiro Sakurai himself, who overlooked the whole project and made sure everything was done right. It may not be confirmed, but to some extent, it's easy to assume this is the kind of version he imagined the characters to behave all along. After all, if you have the chance to realize your cast of expressive characters in a medium which concentrates on everything but gameplay, you will surely use the chance to show everyone what you had originally in mind. But this is probably the kind of King Dedede Sakurai still considers the right one, and I could not agree more. On multiple occasions, Dedede is a narcissistic ruler of a nation, which doesn't really support him to begin with and only wants to realize whatever wacky idea he has in mind. When Kirby arrives on the planet and keeps all the attention for himself, he cannot stand how someone else stays in the spotlight of Dreamland and tries to get rid of him in nearly every situation. But it's not as one-sided as you think, as there are more than one episodes where it is shown that King Dedede needs and wants the assistance of Escargoon or the Waddle Dees, sometimes even Kirby, and helps at the end to take out the true enemy, similar to the games. It's the perfect depiction of a disrespectful, disgusting, self-proclaimed king who's not as direct as a Bowser or King K. Rool for example, but still gives off the vibes of an annoying antagonist. Every episode where it's just Dedede causing the shenanigans without any serious fights or imposing monsters are one of the most entertaining ones and prove how the game should handle his role in them. Some people like to point out how this makes him a rather generic foe or just another Bowser, especially in the show, but there's a slight difference between all these Nintendo villains. Often, platforming franchises make use of a fat, selfish opponent who likes to stay more on the clumsy style, instead of being a very serious foe. This is basically the blueprint since the very first Super Mario Bros. And is even used across the medium instead of just by Nintendo. When people talk about how Eggman or King K. Rool are the Bowsers of their respective franchise, it has nothing to do with their character traits, but the role in the portrayal of the general series. If children are playing outside and one of them wants to be the main hero, there needs to be a clear, recognizable enemy they can put their finger to and identify when looking at the shelves in game stores. Obviously, Bowser, King K. Rool, Eggman, and King Dedede are not the literal same character, but they portray the same antagonistic antagonistic force for their franchise. Of course, people like to point out rivals like Meta Knight, Shadow or Wolf, even though they follow a completely different rule in terms of what they're standing for. Unfortunately, the Kirby animation show was one of the last times King Dedede depicted a truly despicable adversary. With Sakurai being gone after Kirby Air Ride, Kumazaki should handle the franchise henceforth and deal with all the established characters as well as new ones. Kirby Superstar Ultra showed first signs of potential, as the game introduced the famous pause screen lore to the series and added some extra modes on top of the original game's adventure. One mode in particular to point out is Revenge of the King, a new rendition of the original's Kirby's Dream Lands hard mode similar to Revenge of Meta Knight, where King Dedede wants to settle the score with Kirby once and for all. Notice how there's no greater cause or hellish entity kicking off this mode, but just Dedede and Kirby living out their old rivalry. The description even states how the king means serious business this time, and going through the whole mode it just feels like the perfect realization of what King Dedede can be. Instead of getting huge, he just puts up a mask and goes for one, if not the best King Dedede boss fight in the series. By the end, all what is left is a salty defeat, but at least he has still his trusty allies by his side. Naturally, a part why this fight is memorable is the music or amazing Dedede design, but the main reason for being so iconic are easily the simple stakes surrounding the circumstances. There's no greater evil, demonic god or world's end scenario, but a simple all-out duel between a pink fluff ball and a penguin. Occasionally, the weight of a fight is amplified through meaning and memories, which is why Masked Dedede is still referenced to this day in countless entries. No one is jokingly goofy or needlessly serious, yet there's still awareness of both characters to respect their opponent. I don't know about you, but Masked Dedede gives me the same vibes as Mario fighting Bowser in Odyssey, or the DK crew assaulting K. Rool in Donkey Kong 64, a clash between a hero and his villain. I'm aware people enjoy the more and more elaborated lore behind every new game and all the weird entities as final bosses, but sometimes a mode like Revenge of the King has somewhat of a bigger impact, even though the stakes are lower. Dedede is not a weak goofball in this mode, and despite the fact he's the antagonist, it's hard to not feel bad for him in the end. But wait, isn't there another grandiose game that features more than simply Kirby characters? The adventure mode of Super Smash Bros. Brawl is to this day one of the most ambitious projects Nintendo released, and was without a doubt a spectacle ahead of its time. You might argue about the gameplay and level design, but the narrative and cutscenes are everything a Nintendo fan wants and are still missed from modern entries. Once again, you have to be aware that this game was directed by Sakurai, and King Dedede is pretty much the exact version you come to expect. Not necessarily malicious, but with clearly selfish intentions. He collects fighter trophies in order to simply build up a nice collection, unlike every other antagonist who shows explicit traits of evilness. By the end, he's even basically the savior of the whole game, fights Bowser and is happy to see Kirby again. The affection towards Kirby may contradict my point, but only shows King Dedede's true nature. Whenever there's a greater secondary foe, he has absolutely no problems in joining Kirby's companion, as he knows he will be the one to turn things right. Nonetheless, if there's the chance to cause some havoc, he will do it, and the adventure mode of Brawl clearly understood how to balance his character. In modern Kirby games, there's only the secondary foe without any mischievous tricks in between, and it makes him look more stupid than he already is. Just like in Kirby 64, body language as well as facial expressions are everything, and the adventure mode just perfectly portrayed how King Dedede behaves, moves and presents himself. After that, it should take some while until our favorite rival gets the spotlight of the antagonist again. A handful of spin-offs should follow until Kirby's Return to Dreamland kicks in, resurrecting the franchise with a modern, yet classic title. Here we see King Dedede as one of the 4 playable characters, and this is basically where the quote trend of being a serious ally fully started. Out of character, he just decides to help Margolor as well, even though there's no higher benefit benefit he might could get. You could argue the same happened in Kirby 64, but in the same game, we at least see his inner conflict and pride being swallowed in order to not look stupid in front of his subservient. The same might happen in Return to Dreamland, but there's absolutely no sign whatsoever of trying to act cool or impressing Bandana D. I understand they do not want to waste time on a cutscene in the game, which should just lay out the basic premise as fast as possible, but it still doesn't feel right to see the supposed to be rival being so upfront without any reason. In Triple Deluxe, for instance, Dedede gets kidnapped and is forced to fight along Kirby at the end of the game, because his well-being is just as endangered as Kirby's. I'm going to ignore Star Allies, since having allies is simply the main gimmick of this game and there's no time or necessity to focus on someone like Dedede, but one of the last games which stayed true to his character was Kirby Battle Royale for the 3DS. Here, King Dedede organizes some sort of tournament with a lot of fake Kirbys and the prize being a grandiose cake. Because this game has some dialogue, we get to see a side of Dedede's character which is surprisingly similar to his anime adaptation, with all the snarky and arrogant comments he likes to do. It was so refreshing seeing actual dialogue throughout the whole game, and although it was obviously as shallow as you expected from a spin-off like this, it only makes you wonder how much comedic potential Dedede would have in an actual RPG. The last time we could see the rival play the role as a true antagonist so far would be Kirby Fighters 2, where he and Meta Knight simply challenged the pink fluff ball to a duel. It's nothing too special or out of the ordinary, but the more insane the modern title become, the more I appreciate basic plots like in Fighters 2. No joking, no overcomplicated setup, but once again a duel without tricks and even a rare team up with Meta Knight. This brings us finally to the Forgotten Land. As I stated, Dedede might be still mind controlled in this game, but for whatever reason he's way more intimidating and serious than ever before. How his first appearance is staged or crawling on all fours during the second battle makes him look absolutely fearless and actually rather strong. The whole sequence at the end where he's willing to engage a whole army of beasts in order to simply save one Waddle Dee shows the dignity inside him and emphasizes the status of a king. Sitting at the end in the Waddle Dee village as if he's the protagonist of the game is just the icing on the cake, and despite the fact there are some lore snippets that state how he really missed Kirby, I think this was the best way to handle mind controlling yet. So if this dynamic can be actually successful just like in the Forgotten Land, what is the real problem? The main reason why I think King Dedede should be more evil again does not only come from my perspective, but the creators as well. It must be annoying to always come up with some kind of excuse why King Dedede cannot be simply dirty, despite the fact that the adventure mode of Brawl proved how to handle the situation. There's no need for him to find a reason to fight Kirby or do something despicable. He's supposed to be the rival of the franchise for many years and should embrace it more often. Meta Knight already fulfills the role of the more friendly, competitive counterpart perfectly, and just like I mentioned earlier, sometimes the story does not need to go into directions similar to a Bayonetta game. But what do you think about this topic? Which portrayal of King Dedede do you prefer the most, and which game depicted him in the best possible way? He does not need to be Bowser, King K. Rool or Eggman, but I would certainly love to see him being a little more of a true superstar warrior again.